Have you been wondering if maybe a separation is all you need instead of a divorce? And what even is a separation legally? What does it look like? How does it work? And does it make sense for your situation? And then furthermore, if it doesn't and you end up going down the road of divorce, what does that look like? Where do you even begin? What kind of divorce do you need or want to get? And what are the options? There's a lot to think about when you think about the ways to approach divorce. And today I'm going to be talking with Katherine Miller, family law attorney with the Miller Law Group out of New York. And we're going to talk about just that. So stay tuned.
Welcome to the Starting Over Stronger show, where you'll find help and hope for your divorce survival and recovery. Divorce well, live well.
Welcome back to the Starting Over Stronger show. Katherine Miller is joining us today, and Katherine is a family law attorney and founder of the Miller Law Group in New York City. And she founded that group on the principle that couples can divorce with dignity. And her practice takes a personalized, collaborative, and mediation-centered approach to helping couples to make the decisions in their divorce outside of the court, rather than letting them get sucked into having a judge decide everything for them when at all possible. So thank you, Katherine, for being here today, for joining us.
I'm thrilled to be here, Annie. Thanks for having me.
Very good. Well, let's start out, if you wouldn't mind, just tell us a little bit more about you as a person or as an attorney or both.
Yeah, sure. I like to tell people that I went to law school because I was interested in justice, but I learned in the orientation week that's not what law school was going to be about. And in fact, that's not really what the practice of law is about mostly. I come from a family of therapists, and I've always been really interested in people. So as plan B, I thought I would focus my career on the intersection where law meets people in their personal lives. And primarily that's been in family law, and we do some estate planning as well. And, I was practicing, and our practice was about half matrimonial work, divorces, and half child welfare litigation. And it occurred to me really early on that there just had to be a better way for families to resolve conflict. And so I took a mediation training years and years ago when I was out of school, like a couple of years. And I started to try to integrate those ideas, those mediative ideas of settling based on the criteria that were important to people, not necessarily that were important to lawyers. And in every single case, I ran into the same problem. And that problem was the other lawyer, not because they were bad people or bad lawyers or anything like that, but just because we couldn't agree on what those criteria should be when we were talking about settlement. Now, I got to tell you, Annie, that in New York, 97% of divorces settle before a judge makes a decision after a trial. And nationwide, that statistic is 95%. So if you go to your doctor and they say 97% likely this is going to happen, right? You would definitely buy a lottery ticket if your chances were 97%, right? Yeah. The chances are overwhelmingly, statistically speaking, that you're going to settle. And so that means you're going to be making the decisions yourself. So I struggled that way for about 10 years, trying to kind of fit a round peg through a square hole, or the other way around, whatever it is. And then I got divorced myself, and I had 2 little kids, and I was really worried for them and worried for myself as to what would happen if we were unable to resolve it, which we were. It wasn't easy, and my divorce was definitely a high conflict and difficult, and yet we were able to resolve it, like most people, without court intervention. And so after that, I thought, I'm not sure that I can actually align my core values and what's important to me as a human being with what I'm doing in my job. And so I quit my job, and I thought, Annie, that I was going to have to do something else with my life. I mean, there were a lot of other options in hindsight. Rearview mirror is 20/20 for sure. But I was like, nope, I can't be a lawyer anymore, so I got to do something else. But I took a mediation training, and I took a collaborative law training, and I just looked more into what was really possible to help families who are making a transition from one form or another, or family formation, but primarily in divorce and post-divorce issues. How could we really help them find a way to resolve the issues that they face, taking into account what's really important to them, their own priorities and how they see the world, and not forgetting that the law exists, because it definitely is impactful. It's part of the outside, environment that people are dealing with. And so I decided to really focus my efforts on trying to help people divorce with dignity, which to me means divorce with valuing each person's view, and not necessarily everybody getting what they want, because that's not always possible, but really trying to find a way humanistically to help people make this transition. And before I end, I just want to say that when I was getting married for the first time, my grandmother, with whom I was very close, pulled me aside one day and she said, Katherine, you can never get divorced. And I was like, it's ironic because I was a divorce lawyer at the time, right?
Uh-huh.
And so I was like, what are you talking about? If I'm unhappy, I'm going to get divorced. And she said, no, you can't get divorced because family comes first. And what she meant was, you got to put your kids first, no matter if that means that you've got to be a drug addict, an alcoholic, have affairs, whatever it is. You've got to protect the integrity, the structure of the family. And so together with sort of my own experience as a divorce lawyer and helping people kind of figure out what made sense, I really wanted to find a way to make family first, but not make parents stay married to each other.
Yeah.
And how could we find a way where we value family, we value the structure of that, because we're still family to our kids, even if we're divorced parents, right? Yeah. And put those things together. And that's why I founded the Miller Law Group and really got serious about trying to make a difference.
I love it. Well, certainly I can hear your passion, and I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to share that with us, along with some wisdom. And so I think because of your passion in helping couples divorce with dignity, that's really why I thought you would be the perfect person for me to spend some time with today, just asking a series of questions about ways that people can approach the dissolution of marriage. I did recently have a client who came to me as a divorce coach wanting to know more about separation. And I guess because I'm a divorce coach, because none of my clients prior have really gone down that road, I didn't have a ton of answers for her. So I started gathering information for her. And I thought this would be, an important thing for us to talk about, because certainly I'm sure there are a lot of people that this question goes through their mind at some point, and it's a multifaceted subject. So I know that our conversation today will take some twists and turns as we navigate several different angles for people to consider. So for those of you who are listening today that just aren't sure yet if you will be filing for a divorce or how to handle things at all when you sense the end of your marriage may be drawing near, this is going to be a very helpful guide for you for some important considerations that you'll want to know about. So the first subject that I want to tackle, therefore, is separation versus divorce. And I will start by saying that separation is something that I think probably a lot of people consider, even if they don't ever even voice it, or maybe they handle it differently, like an in-home separation for a period of time or something like that. I've had clients on the fence or fearful about divorce ask me this, and it's even something that affected me personally. Before I divorced, I did have an in-home separation of about 18 months. So I just think this is an important topic, and I don't even really know where to begin, because it's such a vague thing, in so many people's minds. So I guess overall, it's kind of like looked at as like a temporary solution to buy people time so that they maybe can get some space emotionally or physically or both before they make a permanent decision. And definitely there's confusion about, what is a legal separation, what is a trial separation, and what is a permanent separation. So if you would just shed some light on those terms for us, and let's just look at each of them briefly.
So I think you have to think about separation in two ways. One is emotional and physical, and the other is legal. And, they're intertwined, and they're like an in-home separation. legally, I don't think there's a state in the union, but I could be wrong. I'm only barred in New York and Connecticut, where that means anything legally, but it sure means something emotionally, right? In your area of practice, right? And so, and all of this is kind of on a continuum, but they're sort of related, right? And so I think the question first is that something people want, right? Do they want to be separate? Do they want to explore what it would be like to not be married in the way they currently are married, right? And by that, I mean, legally, of course, but there's a lot to it that's not legal, right? There's emotional, there's intimacy, there's parenting, there's living arrangements, there's finances. Like all of those things are kind of intertwined before you even do anything legal, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think that from the point of view of people who might be listening and thinking, well, this is something I want to consider, right? Like that, if you're going to start trying a trial separation or physically separating, you should consult a lawyer in your jurisdiction, because there are jurisdictions which, if you physically separate, and I don't mean moving to the guest room, Annie, I mean move to another house or another apartment, you have a separate home, that can have a legal implication for being the end of the financial partnership. That's not true in New York, but it is, I believe, true in California, but I'm not barred there, so I don't, this is hearsay, but so it can't, before you move out or before your spouse moves out, you should consult a lawyer and see what the ramifications are of that. But in New York, people are married until they're either legally separated or divorced from a legal perspective. And you could move out, and people do that, whether or not on a trial basis or a permanent basis, or they just can't stand it and they need a break basis. There are a lot of reasons why people will physically separate. And then you have to consider, and that has really not much of a legal implication. If it lasts for a long time, and we can come back and talk about the details of that could have an implication. But basically, then you're still married, and you're still filing joint tax returns. You're still live on each other's health insurance plans, if that's something you have. You still have a legal obligation to support each other, which spouses do. That doesn't mean you necessarily have the right to get maintenance or alimony or family support or whatever you call it in your jurisdiction, but there is an obligation to support a spouse, and there's, in the law, it's a financial partnership and a financial responsibility as well as a social unit. And so for people who are thinking about separating but aren't sure they want to get divorced, right? I think that's the people that we're talking to. And so whether or not that means that you're going to live separately or in home or out of home, when we start to talk about what the rights are, what are the obligations, I think it's really important. And I speak as a lawyer here, not a coach, but even so, I think it's really important, if there's going to be separation involved, that there be clarity about what's changed and what hasn't changed, right? So if people are separating and you have I'm going to call it a traditional setup where one parent is the breadwinner or the primary breadwinner, and one parent is the primary child carer and homemaker, then that person is often financially dependent on the breadwinner to pay the bills. You want to make sure that those bills are going to keep getting paid and that the status quo for paying the bills is going to be maintained, or you're going to have a really clear agreement as to what is going to be different, so that one person doesn't think one thing, and the other person doesn't think the other thing, and these assumptions are not matching. And you know what they say about making assumptions, that they make an ass out of you and me. And so it's just that can be super painful and frankly expensive going forward.
Yeah. And probably, that conversation needs to happen at a time when, obviously, if you're talking about one of you moving out, things aren't going well. So it's going to be hard to have a conversation like that is productive, and effective. And so that is certainly something to consider. One thing that I know comes up with my clients a lot is when they finally do get to a point where they're like, okay, I know I'm going to file. They just want to move out, or they want him to move out. There's always this question of legally, how will that be viewed by my attorney and my judge, in my future case? They maybe haven't even filed yet, but they just, it could be a really toxic situation or abuse situation where they just feel, a desperate need for flight and they need to get out. And of course, they don't want to leave their children. So then the question becomes, am I doing something wrong if I move out and I live somewhere else and I take my kids with me? What would you say to that?
I think safety always comes first. So whatever the implications are, safety comes first. If you feel that you or your children are at risk, I think I would say to my clients, you should protect yourself and your children physically. That said, you probably shouldn't move out and take the kids otherwise without an agreement or a court order to do that, which is super painful. Annie, it used to be kind of what I think of as the old-fashioned way of thinking about this is you've got to stay until it's all over. I don't think most people do that anymore. I mean, certainly not my clients. People usually separate either before they start the divorce process itself or somewhere along the way, because it's super hard to stay married, living together, coexisting, and negotiating all these things. And particularly, you've got a court involvement. We've got a court date together. Should we drive together? Who wants to do that, right? And so usually along the way, there's some kind of interim, either agreement as to what's going to happen or court order. Now, hopefully, for the sake of the children, the parents are able to work out a parenting plan that works on their own, or at least with the support of professionals other than judges or court personnel. And the beautiful part about that is if you separate and you get to try on maybe different parenting arrangements that might work for you. And so you say, we think a week on, a week off is going to work. And then it turns out, the kids really don't like that. Or there are all these problems we thought of that we lived that we didn't think of before we thought this. And so let's change it to a different kind of arrangement where maybe there's more back and forth between the parents and the kids. And I really like it when that happens, because it really allows you as a family to figure out what's going to work without having something written in stone. Now, just that said, the parenting plan is never written in stone, and then the court always retains what's called a parens patriae, a supervisory role, and can make a decision later on that the best interest of the children is something different than what was written in the agreement. But it's still nice to not to have to do that later on.
Yeah, for sure. And I know one of the factors when people are thinking about separation is certainly financial. They even afford to finance two homes, completely. And I guess a lot of it comes down to the motive for the decision. And if, like you said, it's kind of a trial thing. You want to see how things go. You want to have an opportunity to try it before you buy it, so to speak, see what it's like and what is actually going to work for your family. I think that would probably be one of the healthier approaches to separation. I think one of the less healthy approaches is one that is really fed by fear. And it is that you really know that you need to get a divorce, but you just haven't accepted it yet. Or there's just such a fear about what the future will be like if you do that, that you're, left almost incapacitated and unable to make that decision to, force that to happen. So not that either one of those has to end badly, but I think it's important if you're in this place where you're like, should I separate or should I divorce? I think you really need to dig in and figure out what your motive is and understand what it is that you hope to accomplish. Because I think the healthiest approach to separation is where reconciliation remains a possibility. That it is, certainly, separation is more affordable. It's a more amicable way to discover whether it's feasible to save the marriage and to make the marriage healthy. And so it allows you to take small steps toward your ultimate decision, whether that's reconciliation or an eventual divorce. And so, you have some space to interact with a little bit less stress, fewer arguments, and it should give you the chance to figure out why you haven't been getting along, what you can do about it that you haven't already tried. Certainly you can take steps that will ultimately either revive the marriage or make it clear once and for all that it is irretrievably broken. And that, I think, is a healthy approach to separation. On the other hand, if you're considering separation just for the simple fact of putting off the inevitable because you're afraid of it, that's something else entirely that I think you need to explore, maybe on your own in a journal or maybe with an attorney to really truly understand. Am I going to go through all of these legal steps for a legal separation and spend how much? I don't know, comparatively. And then at some point realize I should have just gotten a divorce, or now I need to do that as well. And there's going to be additional attorney's fees and additional time and emotional investment in that process. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, Annie, that was a lot.
Yeah.
So let me divide it up a little bit if you don't mind. So, one of the things that you said in the beginning is that financially speaking, can people afford to live separately in the same style in which they can afford to live, that they are living together? And chances are no. Chances are there will be some downsizing unless more income comes in. You're adding expenses without adding income. There's probably going to be some changes. Are they worth it? They may very well be worth it. And if you're living miserable and unhappy, and every day is a chore, or there's enough fighting, and your kids are involved, and then it's probably worth it to downsize a little or to make some changes in your life. And maybe they're big, maybe they're not, but most people just can't afford to live the same way separately than they could live together, just from the economies of scale. That doesn't mean that's bad. It just means that it's a thing. You just need to take a look at your, I hate this word, but budget. And I don't like budget because it makes it sound like diet, right? It's really like you should be spending less, right? And a lot of people feel like they should be spending less. There's a lot of self-judgment in the world about how much money people spend on clothes, or how much money they spend at Starbucks, or how much money they spend on vacations or eating out, or, name your poison. But if you take a good look, and sometimes with a financial planning professional, at ways in which you might be able to save money on things that aren't that important for you, then you can focus your money and your resources on what really is important to you. So it's not like just overall horribleness. There's ways to plan this. And I think that's the crucial point, really plan it. Secondly, I think you're talking about the motivation. That's a word you used earlier to have the separation. Is it really like, well, I'm just not the kind of person who gets divorced, like my grandma, right? So separation is a way to be like, divorced, but not divorced. Yeah. I think, you could do that for a while. And sometimes people do that for the rest of their lives. They don't want to remarry, whatever, fine. You could, if you're going to do that, I would suggest a legal separation, because you would want some formality about and protection on both ends, on spending, on asset division, retirement plans, those kinds of things. But if it's going to be, we're just going to be separated forever and just not get divorced, you can't get remarried. So, but other than that, you're all but divorced, fine. Most people don't want that, because from a legal perspective, I can shrug my shoulders and say, fine. But emotionally, that's not a nothing thing, right? And so that's sort of, you're in purgatory, right? Or like in limbo. There's no well, I'm not. I hear from my clients, when they go back out on the market, so to speak, a lot of other people that they might want to date or want to ask, what's your marital status? And if they're like, well, I'm separated, some people are just like, nope. If you're not ready to be single, I'm not ready to be with you. And so, that's something to consider. Yeah. I think, though, that if you're really thinking, wow, this is toxic for me right now, I still love my spouse, he or she still loves me, we need a do-over. We need a fresh start. We're really going to look at this. Then, an informal separation where you should talk to a lawyer anyway, just get a consultation just in your jurisdiction, just to make sure that doesn't have legal implications. It's just from an emotional perspective, just, thinking about this. Always good to get a legal consultation when you're going to make a real change in your lifestyle, just because you don't know where the law intersects you in your personal life, because nobody tells you that in high school or college or anywhere until you walk into a lawyer's office, and it's worth a few $100 to find out, I think. But, what I understand from coaches and therapists and marriage counselors is people usually take that step too late. And so maybe one person thinks we're doing a reset, but the other person is just like, I just need a break, and I don't have the courage or the strength at this moment in time to say I'm done. And so it's just a stepping stone on the way out of the marriage most of the time. And I think if people take in my experience, and I'm a divorce lawyer, people don't come to me when they've reconciled, they come to me when they're getting divorced. So it's a little bit skewed in terms of the people I'm talking to. But most people who do that then take the step to say, all right, I'm out. Now, that doesn't mean you're lying to yourself or you're lying to your spouse or necessarily. I mean, sometimes you just need that space to be like, can I do this on my own? What does this feel like? I want to try this on to see what it feels like to be single again, or single parent, or timeshare with the kids, and see what it's like for the kids. And maybe it will suck for everybody and we'll move back in together. But chances are you won't. I mean, just statistically speaking.
Yeah. Yeah. I can't remember now. I did read statistics on that at some point. It was several years ago. I want to say it was something like at least 80% of people who separate ultimately get divorced at some point.
Yeah.
Somewhere around there.
And then, like, to deal with the last piece of what you said, I think that, if you imagine you're married, you've got kids, they're 8, 10, and 12 and whatever, it doesn't really matter. They're minor children living at home, right? And chances are you're probably not going to be able to afford another home the same size as the marital home. And so the person who's moving out lives in a 1-bedroom. Now this is a kind of a little bit of a trap, because then the family adjusts to the 1-bedroom added expense. It's not that much, but that's really a drag for those 3 kids in my example, right? Because they can't really stay over with whichever parent is in the 1-bedroom. So what are you going to do about that? And so you have to really think through not just the finances, but the parenting. A lot of things that people are doing these days is doing this bird nesting arrangement, at least in the beginning, where the kids stay in the house and the parents go back and forth. And whether or not they rent a studio apartment that they share on the outside, or they rent separate places, or they sleep on a friend's couch, or in their childhood bedroom, or whatever it is. It allows it's pretty stable for the kids, and it allows people to sort of experience not living together in a way that might not be that expensive long term. And that's kind of hard to do. And you definitely need the right people. You definitely don't want to be furious. Listen, every time I leave, there's a fully stocked refrigerator and the dishwasher is empty. And I come back, dishwasher is full, there's dirty dishes in the sink, and there isn't even milk for my coffee. Like, that's not fair.
Yeah.
So you need to work that out as well.
Yeah, that would be complicated. Are you getting the support you need as you divorce or face the possibility of divorce? Did you know that for just $55 a month, you can be a part of a 1-hour weekly support group call of people just like you? Some haven't even filed yet, but they know the marriage is not sustainable or healthy. Some were served papers they didn't want. Others are feeling empowered that they finally took the reins of their life and hired an attorney and a divorce coach to help them navigate the uncertain waters of divorce. All of them are facing fear, grief, loss, confusion, and pain, and they're finding help and hope in a Starting Over Stronger support group. You can get registered today for a group at startingoverstronger.com/groups and start this week in getting the help you need to divorce well and then live well. Remember, divorce is hard. Life after doesn't have to be, but the support you get now is what makes the difference. Have you heard anything as far as long-term psychological, aspects of what the kids experience in the nesting environment?
Yeah, I think it's more stable for kids, and that their lives are. Well, let me put it to you this way: I had a client who did this with her ex-husband, and she, maybe a year later, I was talking to her about something, and she said, I really hate this going back and forth between our marital home and my apartment. I hate the going back and forth. And I said, well, you didn't have to set it up that way. We could have arranged it so that you had a place and you just stayed there and the kids went back and forth. And she said, what, I'm so glad we did, because I wouldn't want to put this on them, right? The back and forth, it was like John and I, not his name, couldn't work it out. But, the pain of that shouldn't be on our kids. It should be on us to deal with the ramifications. And so she was pleased that they'd allowed that. Now, their kids were in high school. It wasn't going to be forever. I think the thing that you have to, and this is, again, more of your area than mine, but one thing to be careful about is children always hope that their parents are going to get back together.
Yeah.
And so you don't want to do something that indicates to them that you are going to get back together if you're really not going to get back together. So They hold out this kind of false hope. They'll probably hold out false hope anyway, but you don't want to make it confusing for them.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. And in fact, I have not studied it thoroughly, but I have heard some feedback that if you're going to do the nesting, it's best if you only do it during the course of the divorce and not beyond that, because it can be psychologically confusing for the kids. They don't get closure. They don't really feel the transition that they need to feel that the marriage is over. Yeah. And so that is definitely something to keep in mind, that it really should maybe be viewed as more of a temporary solution and not a permanent one. So do you think we have fully explored the decision about whether separation is appropriate for someone or not, or is there anything else?
Well, let me just kind of give you a little sausage factory on the law, if you don't mind, because
Sure.
I just, I think that people don't really understand this. So there's living together, husband and wife, or wife and wife, husband and husband, spouse and spouse. You're living together, you're married, right? You decide that you want some distance from each other, and you decide you want to physically separate. That may or may not be legally significant in your jurisdiction, and so you should check. If you're going to live separately, it probably makes sense to have a short written understanding, whether or not you have it drafted by lawyers or you just draft it yourself, about how you're going to continue to pay the bills, what's going to happen with it. Doesn't have to be a 70-page agreement, just something that's really clear. We're going to maintain the financial status quo and include this additional apartment or whatever additional expenses in the family expenses is how we're going to do it, right? And maybe you can have that conversation yourself. Maybe you need some professional assistance, but just to make sure nobody is surprised by what the impact of that is. Then you may decide that you want to have a legal separation, meaning you're living apart, either by according to the terms of a judicial decree, which is extremely unusual these days, or by written agreement, a separation agreement, right? And the separation agreement goes through what I think of as the big three and then a bunch of supporting issues. The big three are parenting. So separate and apart from money, this is decision making. How will you make important decisions for your kids? Where they go to school, who their doctors are, are they going to have a surgery? Are you going to let them have a tattoo? What about curfew, getting a car? These are important decisions, not what color socks they're going to wear in the morning. Right. And it's also time sharing. When will the kids be with each parent? And that really comes down to regular time, just week in, week out, weekends, the regular rotation. And then there's special time, holidays, vacations. How are you going to do that? So what's that going to be? So that's one big piece of it. Another big piece is assets and liabilities. What do you have? What do you owe? What's marital? And how are you going to divide that up? And then there's cash flow, right? What does it cost to live your lives? How are you paying those bills now? How is that going to be in the future, living separately? And is there going to be cash flow between you, which we could characterize either as child support or alimony under one of the various names? It could be maintenance, family support, a bunch of other things, right? So, and then how is that? What's it going to be immediate right away? And then how's it going to change over time? Kids get older, they leave home, they go to college. One parent makes more money, another parent makes less money. What about retirement? What about all that stuff, right? What's that plan going to be? And then also included in that separation agreement is things like income taxes. How are you going to handle past audits, health insurance, life insurance, estate planning? What happens if somebody defaults on the agreement? What will happen then? All those kinds of what if things that lawyers like me, worry about that most people don't worry about, right? And that's a separation agreement. You sign that agreement, you're living apart pursuant to the terms of it. It means you usually divide the assets, you put into place the cash flow plan, and you're legally separated. And there are some assets that you can't divide until you're divorced, like certain retirement assets and stuff like that. But basically, all but divorced. maybe you can file a joint tax return. Maybe you can't. Depends on what your tax preparer proposes. Sometimes you can be included in a family health insurance plan. Sometimes you can't. Depends on the insurer. And so you should check with that. One thing you cannot do is remarry because you're married. It's black and white. You are married, right?
Yeah.
So should you become legally separated and then later want to get divorced, there's nothing really else to do other than to argue about, other than to just get divorced, because that separation agreement will become most likely the underlying document for the divorce. Like you basically decided all that stuff. Now you're just going to file some papers with the court and ask the court to actually divorce you so that you're now separate. Single, you can remarry. You cannot file a joint tax return. You cannot, most likely, except for a tiny percentage of health insurers will allow an ex-spouse to be included on a family policy. So those are the things, kind of along the way. If you get to the point of a separation agreement, we'll often do that even when people are getting divorced, but we might call it a settlement agreement, or stipulation of settlement, but it's the same document with the same big three and the same supporting issues. And so these issues are really closely related. If you're getting to the point where you cannot agree on the separation agreement, you're probably going to get divorced, right? If you're thinking you're going to stay separated, just because that would be really conflictual and difficult. And again, some people decide to stay legally separated until the end of time, or then at their end of their time on earth. That's totally fine. There's nothing, it doesn't, by signing the agreement, sometimes people think that you'll just sign it and then it will mature into a divorce. No, somebody actually has to file papers. You have to know, everybody has to be given notice about that. It doesn't just magically happen.
That's a really great explanation. I think what rises to the surface for me on that is it's pretty clear that either you're entering into separation as a permanent arrangement or you're not. And if you don't intend for it to be permanent, or you don't know how long it's going to last, it would behoove you to more or less treat it like a divorce light and just do everything except that final. Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah. So that's one side of this conversation. The other side is, the person who maybe has been separated for a long time or thought about separation, and now, because of what we've just shared, decided, no, I think we just need to go through with the divorce. Maybe that's going to be the better solution. How do you go about directly answering the question for someone if say you're consulting with someone and they're not sure which way they're going? What are the factors that you suggest they consider?
Well, I think that it's really important to really thoughtfully consider how you're going to make the decisions that need to be made in order to get legally separated or divorced. And because the decision about how is going to have a huge impact on the results that you get, both in terms of your own sense of happiness with how it turned out, your own sense of yourself going through it, and the relationship that you have with your family, your former spouse, your children going forward. And so I think it's important to understand what the basic options are. And they really range on the one end as DIY, right? And to a judge making a decision after a trial, right? And so you make the decisions entirely on your own, somebody makes them entirely for you, and then kind of a range of options in between. I have to say that DIY is really hard when you've been married for more than a couple of years and you've got kids. When I got divorced, I'm a divorce lawyer. I did not do it myself, right? It's just because once you're emotionally involved, it really helps to have some guidance, right? Mm-hmm. Then oftentimes people will choose mediation, which can be with attorneys involved or not involved. But you hire a neutral facilitator, a mediator who is maybe a lawyer, but doesn't have to be. That lawyer is not going to give legal advice, but maybe some legal information. Who will help you identify the issues that need to be resolved, help you gather the information that you need in order to resolve those issues, like what's in the bank accounts and what are the retirement accounts worth and what's the house worth and what do you owe on your credit cards and how much does it cost to groceries each month, these kinds of things. And then help you identify what's important to each of you, and how you see the situation, what your personal criteria are, help generate options for resolution, and then test those options against what's important to each person, what's realistic, and through that process of back and forth, kind of reach a settlement agreement. Sometimes I think it's always a good idea for people to have lawyers to be able to give them legal advice. I mean, maybe you don't use the lawyer that much. Maybe you involve the lawyer in every single meeting. That's up to you. But that this is a huge decision, maybe the biggest business deal you're going to make in your entire life. You should have somebody who's your advocate tell you what he or she thinks makes sense for you. You don't have to agree. Like, the lawyer is not the boss of you, right? You're the boss of the lawyer. So you don't have to, if your lawyer says, I wouldn't do that if I were you, and you still want to do it, that's for you to do. Like, that's your choice. Then there's something called collaborative divorce, which is sort of, I think, next on the line. And in collaborative divorce, each person has a lawyer, but the lawyers by contract are disqualified from litigating. So nobody's thinking, I'm going to file a motion, I'm going to go to court, I'm going to do anything except help these people reach a settlement. And it's really the same idea of mediation as voluntary process, where people make decisions based on their own criteria and their own understanding of their own views and the view of the other person, and reach resolution. But it's a little bit more structured, and it's a little bit more supportive than mediation, which requires the people involved to do a lot of the legwork themselves. The lawyers are going to be helping them gather the information, helping them talk it through outside of the sessions, not just inside the session. So there's just more support involved. And it's also usually an interdisciplinary process. So sometimes we work with financial neutrals who can help with that financial planning and option generating that we just talked about before, where you're trying to find a way to maintain as much of your lifestyle as you possibly can and looking forward. And also involves mental health professionals who deal with the emotional fallout, right, of the divorce and the conflict dynamic between the couple. Because as you can imagine, when people are having these negotiations about their separation or divorce, sometimes there's fighting. It's shocking, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes there's disagreement. And also the mental health professional can help the parties come up with a parenting plan that really takes into account their own kids and the life stage and developmental stage that the children are at, and how that might change over time, and help them think through pros and cons of different kinds of arrangements. So that can be really helpful. And then, the next step is to hire lawyers who aren't disqualified from litigating. So you have the court in the background as a possibility. And sometimes there's interim motion practice, meaning you go to court because you can't agree on how to pay the bills during the divorce process, or you go to court because one person needs money from the other person for legal fees, or you go to court to figure out a separate living arrangement, how you're going to live with one person wants to move out. What are you going to do with the kids? Like, as we talked about earlier in the show. And, the worst case scenario is you're unable to resolve it, and you go all the way to litigation, where you give the judge decision-making power over one or more issues in the case. And, that can include how the kids spend Christmas, in some jurisdictions, and I think this is becoming more and more popular, particularly after the pandemic, because the court system is really, really backed up pretty much everywhere. This idea of a private judge or arbitration, where you give the power to a private individual who's not a judge to make the decisions for you. That's never my goal for my clients, is to give over decision-making about their families and their finances to basically a stranger.
Mm-hmm.
I always think it's better if they can work it out themselves, but some people need the discipline of an external source.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, wow, there's a lot to unpack there. And certainly, as any listener is digesting all of that, they probably have some idea of what direction they would see their situation going. And I think one of the things that you mentioned, and I don't know exactly how you said it, but I remember thinking I wanted to speak about this a little bit more, is something that a lot of people either don't know or just fail to hold in their mind as they go throughout the process. And that is that there are only two decision makers in any divorce, whether you DIY, you collaborate, you mediate, you litigate, you argue, it doesn't matter what you do and how you handle it, what process you take. Only you and your spouse make decisions. And you want to bear that in mind, because that is the goal, really, if you think about it. I mean, obviously, if you have to go to court, you're abdicating that decision-making status to a judge or private judge, as you said, someone else who doesn't know you, doesn't know your kids, doesn't know your family. And even if both of you testified before that person and told your life story in the greatest detail you could possibly come up with in that moment, they still wouldn't know you. And so they are going to make decisions based on a lot of different factors, but they can't possibly make them as well as you and your spouse. So don't give up that decision maker status to anyone. Hold on to that. It's a valuable thing.
It is. And, the thing is that I think people end up having somebody else make a decision because they feel they're right, and they feel that the other person is so wrong. And of course, any rational external person would see that I'm right and you're wrong, right? And like that's a trap. That's a trap for people to fall into. And I think that for your kids and for yourself, you're right. Right. Now let's move on to getting this resolved, because that's not going to happen. Nobody wins in divorce litigation in front of a court. Judges will tell you that there are no winners because it is not going to be decided in the same way you would decide it. And if you win one particular issue, you're going to lose some others, and it's going to be an unhappy and costly experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, one of the principles of the collaborative method is a concept that divorce requires a team working well together. And this is a concept in and of itself that I believe could change divorce as we know it, even in the worlds of mediation and litigation. And that is to say that we need to, I feel like, reprogram people's minds to stop thinking that the first step when they decide they're no longer happily married is to call a litigator or hire an attorney and start duking it out. I believe step one, in order to provide as the best possible, most collaborative, least stressful experience, is to hire a divorce coach who can help guide you in mindful attorney selection, making sure that the attorney that you choose is someone that would be a good fit for you in your specific situation, and allow that coach to help you build your team. Even if you don't collaborate, which I certainly think more people need to collaborate, more people are a good fit for collaboration, just don't know it exists. So certainly that's something I'm sure that you work on all the time, just educating people on how effective and how important it is. But also to connect people with the financial advice they need, the therapist they need, the insurance and credit and other professionals that, their unique case nuances are going to provide a need for or benefit from. And so, first of all, what are your thoughts on this approach at large, regardless of what type of divorce they pursue?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I love the question, Annie, because I think of divorce as like a knitting basket that a kitten has gotten into, right? And so you've got the red yarn and the blue yarn and the yellow yarn and the green. It's all knotted up together, right? So, the green is the money and the red is the intimate relationship and the blue is the parenting and, whatever it is, right? And it's all like tangled up. So you start pulling on one and all the other yarns come with, right? And so if you think about the professional help that you're going to get, you want someone who's going to address the green yarn and someone who's going to address the blue and like help untangle all that stuff. Because otherwise, just keep yanking. Something's going to break or, it's just going to take you a really long time to yank the red out if you're not also addressing the blue and the green and the yellow. And I think that really makes a lot of sense, regardless of which method you choose to get divorced. You're going to have to untangle a whole lot of stuff. And if you just go to a lawyer who's just going to yank on the red, it's going to take longer and it's going to be really painful to get it done. So in that approach of taking this sort of multidisciplinary approach where we work with a professional who can help you deal with the feelings, and a professional who can help you deal with the money, and a professional who can help you deal with the negotiation and the legal aspect, and that we work together as a team to support the family through the transition, then that untangling and rewinding of I believe they're called skeins, well, I'm not a knitter, of yarn, into their proper spots, or knitting the sweater or the blanket or the booties or whatever it was that you were there trying to do, we can re-knit it into a supportive structure for every member of the family going forward. So I completely think that makes a lot of sense. And it makes a lot of sense to work with a divorce coach, no matter what method you're using. I mean, maybe your spouse took you to court and there's nothing you can do about that. Don't forget your divorce coach, because that person can really help you make thoughtful, proactive, constructive decisions, no matter what the other person is doing. Each person makes their own decisions, and you can only really keep your side of the street clean. Don't think it's a false idea to think that your spouse is forcing you to do something. You have decision making, you have authority and autonomy over your own decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously you can't control what somebody else does, but you can control your response. And that goes a long way sometimes, because oftentimes our responses are what feed into patterns. And so, it's important to work with someone that can help you understand, that knows divorce, that can help you know what's coming down the line and how to make better decisions as you go. So definitely a more mindful approach to all of it, which, I know just from the little bit that I've learned about you, that's certainly your heart for people going through divorce. So
absolutely.
So what final thoughts do you have for listeners who are feeling the whole, I want a divorce, but now what? Where do I even begin? What would you say to them?
Yeah, I would say do some research and talk to people. I would talk to a coach. I think that's a great idea as a place to start. Find a coach who can help you think about what you're going to do and how you're going to do it, and how you're going to break the news to your spouse if he or she doesn't already know. I think talk to lawyers who can help you in your jurisdiction. Don't just talk to one. And I think it's a very common mistake. Listen, making a decision to get divorced makes people anxious. It made me anxious. It makes people anxious. And when you feel anxious and a little bit ashamed, maybe you go to someone who deals with this all the time. It can be really tempting just to say, oh, phew, I talked to Joe lawyer or, Linda lawyer, and they heard me and they didn't judge me. So I'm just going to go with what Joe or Linda does. But, find out from everyone what they think, how they would approach it, and talk to people who've been divorced. What would they say in your area? Things to avoid. Now, I wouldn't take their advice to be the God's honest truth necessarily, but just to sort of think about pitfalls, things to watch out for, things you might not know. What's their story and what would they say to you? And there are a lot more people who've been divorced than right now.
Yeah.
It's all around. And so I think that that's really helpful. I think that there's one thing I'd like to say, Annie, before we end, if that's okay. Something to watch out for. And this is the thing that I call the chump factor, CHUMP. No one wants to be a chump, right? And I think when people are getting divorced, they worry about that a lot. I don't want to look like an idiot. I could have gotten more. I could have paid less. These are not really necessarily important things. What's really important is what's important to you, what's important to your kids, and how you want to think about yourself moving forward. And so really, I said this earlier, you are the primary decision maker about your life. You're locked in a conflict maybe with your spouse that you need to work out together one way or the other. You should really do that as thoughtfully as you possibly can and get help so that you're not too reactive.
Yeah, good advice. Well, thank you. I think we've covered it very well. It's kind of an intro course into what the beginning stages of divorce look like. And I think it's something that a lot of people will benefit from, just knowing what their options are and what those options kind of look like for the beginning stages anyway. So thank you for joining me today and sharing.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. And thank you, listeners, for joining us each week as we talk about the things that matter to you as you approach and go through your divorce. We'll see you here again next week for more help as you divorce and hope as you are starting over stronger.